Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Johannes Servan. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy here at UIB. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote lecture on migration, climate change, and voluntariness by Christine Straehle. Her lecture takes its departure from one of the morally most challenging issues associated with climate change, and that we have been discussing for the last week in our course on climate change and the inequality of mobility, namely the displacement of historical communities. And when I say a moral challenge, it indicates that her interest is not so much the empirical research findings on displacement as the exploration of the philosophical arguments. From this perspective, she will discuss the moral relevance of the specific harm of experienced by communities forced to move due to climate-related disasters, and how their situation challenges the conception that climate-induced migration should be seen as an equivalent to political refugees. Christine Straehle is professor for practical philosophy at the University of Hamburg. She has published extensively on issues in the intersection of moral and political philosophy and public policy. To mention just a few related to today's topic, in collaboration with David Miller, one of the other guest lecturers at our course, she published the anthology, The Political Philosophy of Refuge in 2019. And in 2017, she published her monograph on vulnerability, autonomy, and applied ethics. Please write your comments and questions in the chat for the Q&A after the lecture. And it's an honor to have you with us, Christine, today, and I hope you join me in welcoming Professor Straehle, at least symbolically, with a Zoom applause.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Johannes, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. So I want to talk about migration, climate change, and voluntariness. And what you see in this first slide is, unfortunately, a phenomenon that we have become much too used to, namely, it is a refugee camp. I can't tell you which refugee camp, but it is a refugee camp. So a camp where people arrive after they have fled their country of origin in search for a better life, many people say, right? And so here in the next slide, what you see is actually a different imagination or a different representation of what we often think of as climate refugees. So some people think that we should think of those who leave their country of origin because of climate change. We should think of these people also as refugees, right? These people are leaving their country of origin. So that, of course, raises the question that I want to address. To what extent we want to talk about climate migration as climate refugeehood. So here's just a slide to give you some of the figures that we know of today, how the world is reacting to climate change. So as you see, we see an increase in internal displacement of people due to natural disasters. And when I say internal displacement, what I mean is to say that people very often leave where they are working and living, but they're not leaving their country. They're very often just simply try to get somewhere within the country in order to find safety, right? And so we see that on the top right, 30.7 million new displacements have been associated with natural disasters in 2020. 145 countries in the world have been identified with disasters in 2020. We see 4,063 displacements in 2020 per million inhabitants of the world, and 58 displacements every minute in 2020. And the other figure that I want to draw your attention to are the individual locations of the highest incidence of natural disasters. And these are the East Asia and the Pacific with 39%, and South Asia with 30%. So a lot of natural disasters happen in the global South, right? If you compare that with Middle East and North Africa, it's only 1%, Europe and Central Asia, only 1%. Okay, now if people talk about climate migrants as refugees, then of course we need to ask ourselves, who actually is a refugee? And the document we often refer to when we talk about this question is, of course, the Geneva Convention with its several amendments between 1949 and 1951. And in the convention, the definition that we're given of who is a refugee is, and I quote, "A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it," end of quote. And of course, you note that the Geneva Convention framers weren't thinking about women and men at the time yet. They were just thinking of the general he. So this is the definition of who is counted in the international refugee regime as a refugee, right? And so the question that I want to address is, to what extent we actually can talk of climate migrants as climate refugees? To what extent is that a helpful category when thinking about people who leave their country of origin due to natural disaster? And the second question that I want to raise is, to what extent the kind of adaptation strategies that we now have in the international policy realm, to what extent these adaptation strategies can actually alleviate the harm of climate change or of the climate-induced migration. So let me start with what I call the equivalence argument. Some people argue that climate migrants should be counted as climate refugees. And there are three arguments that we can summarize that are motivated in favor of this argument. The first one is, as we just saw in the definition from the Geneva Convention, that refugees are not protected by their state of origin in their basic rights of their basic needs. And we can say, well, the same applies to climate migrants. Climate migrants, like refugees, don't have their basic human rights to basic needs protected by their home state. This is not necessarily like in the case of refugees because the home state actively persecutes them, but it may simply be because their state can no longer protect their human rights, right? So if we have the typical case of a Pacific island that is sinking, then we can say that the state in question just simply doesn't have the means any longer to protect the basic human rights of its citizens because the territory is sinking. So this is the first argument in favor of making the equivalence between climate migrants and refugees. The second argument is one that is often used, as we saw in the definition by the Geneva Convention. Refugees are considered people who flee persecution. So they don't leave voluntarily, they don't migrate voluntarily, but instead they react to the persecution. Similarly, we can say that climate migrants don't choose to move. Many would rather stay where they are. This is where they live, this is where they have their family, this is where their family comes from, etc. So we can say that in this respect, refugees and climate migrants might also be similar. And then thirdly, people say, well, we should think of climate migrants as refugees because climate migrants, like some refugees, won't be able to return. So refugees very often settle in a different country. And in fact, when we think about the asylum system as we know it today, the one promise that asylum makes is to provide for refugees with new membership in a new home, right? People get the whole set of rights that they had in their previous country in the new state in order for them to be able to make that new state into their new home. And we do this in the asylum system because we think that people won't be able to return home. Similarly, we can say, well, climate migrants won't be able to return because the whole point of moving due to natural disaster is that they have no longer access to a livelihood in their country of origin. And so there's nothing to return to, we could say. So these are three arguments why people think that climate migrants should be considered climate refugees. Here now are two arguments that I want to propose why it doesn't make sense to think of climate migrants as climate refugees. So why we shouldn't use the equivalence argument. And the first one is that when we think about refugees, as we saw again in the Geneva Convention, we often think of it as an individual phenomenon. We think of it as a person, maybe with the members of their family, who flee persecution. Persecution is often thought of as an individual attack, right? Of course, this is very different for climate migrants. As we know, natural disasters doesn't hit individuals, it hits stretches of country, stretches of territory, and it very often hits communities. So in this respect, I want to say that climate migration is very different from being a refugee, because it is a collective phenomenon, not an individual phenomenon. The second argument I want to propose against the equivalence argument is to say that climate migrants have very different needs than refugees to help address the harm of migration. So again, as I just said, when we provide assistance to refugees, we provide them with a new home, we provide them with political, civic, and social rights in their new home, and we try to compensate them for the loss that they have suffered by having been persecuted in their country of origin, by giving them a new country and giving them a new home. But I don't think that we can say that we can do the same thing for climate migrants, because I think that we can't compensate them for the harm that climate migration actually induces. So this is the second point that I want to work a little bit more on. So can we think of the adaptation measures that we have often discussed now as actually being able to address the harm that climate migration induces? So what are we thinking of when we talk about adaptation measures? One of the strategies that is very often and maybe most often used is relocation. We know that many countries in the world try to identify territory, try to identify places where they can relocate some of their citizens. Again, think of the early slide where I showed you where the natural disasters hit hardest and who is actually hit hardest. And those are countries in the global south. Of course, we also know that many countries in the global north think about adaptation, but they don't necessarily think about relocation. If we think about the Netherlands, for example, they think about how to compensate for rising sea levels, but they don't think of relocation in terms of relocating the people who live in the polders and have to move somewhere else. Similarly, if you think of New York is not necessarily thinking about relocation, they think about building higher seawalls. But very many of the most hardest hit natural disaster countries have to think about relocation. And so in its deliberations, for example, the member states of the United Nations in the Cancun framework, as much as the UNHCR, have always promoted planned relocation as one of the adaptation strategies that we should adopt in order to address the harm that climate migration induces, right? And so the idea here is that we find a territory where communities, because remember I said that climate migration is very often a collective phenomenon and not an individual phenomenon. So we would try to find territories where communities can relocate to. Okay, but now think about this. And I quote, in 2007, the Council of Elders of the Carteret Islands formed an NGO called Tulele Paisa, Sailing the Waves on Our Own. Tulele Paisa developed the Carteret Integrated Relocation Project, a community-led relocation model to coordinate the voluntary relocation of Carteret Islanders to Bougainville Island, 100 kilometers to the northeast. The location of the relocation site was critical to ensure sufficient land for the Carteret families to be economically self-sufficient. It also prioritized food security by ensuring access to traditional fishing grounds, which was important for nutritional and cultural reasons. Nevertheless, despite the apparent opportunity for livelihoods, food security, and access to health services, the future through relocation was seen as uncertain, and few wished to relocate to the new site, end of quote. So what happened actually in the Carteret Islands is that it was a deliberative bottom-up, as we often call it, initiative. Members of the Carteret group tried to find a territory where the community could relocate to. The new territory had lots of advantages, and then it was put to vote whether or not the community should actually relocate. And note that this is from the quote, or the initiative was in 2007, because at the time, it was assumed that the Carteret Islands would have been sunk by this point in 2022. Lucky for the Carteret Islanders, it's still not, it hasn't sunk yet, but the danger was there. And even though we had this kind of very, very collective and communal enterprise, people didn't want to relocate. Right? So this is maybe the best case of relocation that we can imagine. And even in this best case scenario, people didn't want to relocate. So why do I think that this is significant? Because in the first instance, of course, I don't think that adaptation strategies like relocation can address the harm of climate-induced migration, because it's always involuntary, right? So even in the Carteret example, people had to take a decision to leave their country of origin, to leave their country, the cultural territory where they had lived for generations. And they were driven to this decision, not because they thought that they could find a better life somewhere else, like many other migrants, but because they had to, because they were told that their territory would sink. Second, I think that these decisions, when they're taken involuntarily, can never be counted as autonomous decision. So they can never be counted as part of what other people have called a migration project that people may engage in order to improve their lives or the lives of their children. But instead, it is always, to some extent, a decision under duress. And the particular example or the particular incidence of the duress, for example, in the Carteret Island example, is that, of course, people have to leave a territory behind that provides them with what we in philosophy call the background conditions of autonomy. So it provides them with cultural markers. It provides them with the kind of landscape that they have known. It provides them with the landscape that their ancestors have known. So you can relate to the history of your people through the landscape, because you know that your ancestors have lived on the landscape. It provides them with the kind of culinary traditions that they have known, because they live off the land. And so in that respect, we can never, it seems to me, say that the decision to move due to climate-induced disasters is a voluntary one. And the reason why we therefore should not think of adaptation strategies like relocation as effectively addressing the harm that comes from climate-induced migration is that if we have to take decisions, if we are coerced to take decisions, then this is a very particular harm, because these decisions, as I just said, are never autonomous. And that is a real serious harm that nobody can be compensated for. And so in conclusion, I want to make the argument that we are not too quick in thinking that if we can adapt and find relocation territory for groups that have to move because of climate change, that we've actually effectively addressed the harm. But the second point that I started out with is to say that I don't think that we are helping people who have to move for climate-induced reasons if we address them as refugees, because I don't think that we satisfy what their needs are. And as we see, it's very difficult to address the needs of climate-induced migration. And I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for an interesting and provoking paper, I think. Yeah, the floor is open for questions, so please raise questions in the chat. Maybe you could, while we wait for questions, maybe you could, I could challenge you a bit on this one. So there's two things I think that one could raise. So I think the argument you make that it's a specific harm that you might not experience in the same way as a political refugee seems plausible. But would this argument also apply to, say, people who flee from conflicts, like we see in Ukraine now? Would they have the same, would they experience the same kind of harm, you think?
So I think in that respect, we could still say that people who flee a conflict like Ukraine, that the harm that is inflicted on them can be addressed individually, right? And can be addressed through the asylum system. So they have not lost the protection of the government because the government persecutes them, but they have lost the protection of the government because the government has to fight the aggressor, which is Russia, right? So in that case, it's a case of, in Ukraine, it's a case of the government not being able to protect their basic human rights. And so, but we're not thinking of it as a kind of collective phenomenon. It's not that we can only protect people and address the needs that they have if we take in all Ukrainians at once, right? We can take individual families, which is what many countries have done, and we can provide them with shelter for a certain period of time in the hope that at some point they can go back, right? So this is another aspect of this, that of course, in terms of refugee protection, we have many different instruments at our disposal. We can provide them with sanctuary, or we can actually resettle them. But if we provide them a sanctuary, which is what we're doing with Ukrainian refugees, then of course the idea is that they should be able to go back. And that is of course what Ukrainians themselves hope for. And so we don't need to think about making them permanent residents, citizens, etc. So I think the distinction that I want to make stands.
Is there a question? I
Yeah.
can't see it.
So I'm going to read the question. If communities are being evicted from a land by the government so that they can establish a conservation project, can we also classify them as climate refugees, despite the land not being harmed by the community living there? Thanks, Latifa, for this question. So again, I'm advocating for not calling them climate refugees, but they are certainly displaced. Now, the scenario that you described is a really interesting one, right? So the government seems to want to do a good thing, namely establish a conservation area. But in order to do that, they displace a community. Similar cases, of course, have occurred when governments try to build dams in order to satisfy electricity demand in some parts of the country, or when governments have tried to enable companies to mine, then they have displaced communities that were living originally on the territory. So in that respect, again, I don't think that they are refugees. And I also don't think that they are climate-induced migrants, because of course, we could very easily imagine the scenario where the government just says, well, you can't mine here, or we can't build the dam here because there are people living here, right? So in that respect, I think this is a different injustice, namely the injustice that a government is not taking the interest of its citizens and the communities that live on that land seriously. Of course, in philosophy, we make adjustments. We weigh the benefits and the burdens, right? So the burden is incredibly high for the community who lives there and might be displaced. But the benefit, one could say, is potentially for the greater community, right? So if you think about a dam project, and you think China has done many of those and has displaced cultural communities, you could say, well, can we satisfy the displacement with the great gain that the whole of a community or a region can gain from the electricity that is generated through a dam? And to what extent can people who are displaced in the construction of this dam be compensated, right? Can they be provided with better housing, with better healthcare, and so on and so forth? But as I try to illustrate with the Carteret example, sometimes these advantages just don't count as advantages when people think about whether or not they should move, right? Sometimes people just want to stay where they are, even if where they could be moving to might provide them with better resources and better healthcare and better food security.
Good. So we have another question from Irene. So how could you isolate political and economical factors from climate factors in driving people to migrate? And how could we justify asking communities to move before the climate change impact actually occurs, say coastal flooding of Carteret Islands?
Thanks, Irene. That's a really good question. So I think it's a very difficult question because, of course, the compensation is precisely what the problem is, right? We can't really we can't really think about how to identify what we owe people. Now, of course, you say, well, economical factors and political factors certainly play a role, right? One of the examples that is often used, and we've talked about this, is the earthquake in Haiti, right? So the earthquake in Haiti is just simply a natural phenomenon or a natural disaster. But how the state reacted to that disaster has a huge impact in Haitians wanting to leave the country, because they didn't actually see that the state was trying to reestablish the communities and the housing and so on and so forth, and didn't actually provide them with the necessities of life, right? So the first part of your question, I think, addresses the very, very problematic interlinkage between different factors that make people into climate migrants. And of course, people don't always become climate migrants from one day to the other. It's not that people are displaced by an earthquake, or it's not necessarily that people are displaced by natural disaster, but in one go, but it's a very slow process, right? So you have aridity, you have lack of rain, you have drying up fields, and that drives you to migrate. And so in that respect, I think we need to take into consideration the gradual process that climate migration very often is. And then the second part of your question is, how can we justify asking communities to move before climate change impact actually occurs, right? And so this is, as you say, the example of Carteret. And here, as I said, in the Carteret Island example, it didn't happen. The islands are still there. But the prognosis was that they would be sunk. And so in that respect, I think the state, of course, has a duty of care towards its citizens. And it is part of the duty of care to warn us as citizens of impending danger and disaster. And so, where in Norway, if the Norwegian region government didn't alert its citizens of any kind of earthquake, I don't know how often earthquakes happen in Norway, actually, but maybe not that often. It's not exactly on the tectonic shifts, but imagine that the government wouldn't warn its citizens of impending disaster. Then we would, of course, fault the government for not doing that, because now we have the kind of technology in place that we can do that. So it falls into the jurisdiction of a state to take care of its citizens, and that is the justification. So the duty of care of the state towards its citizens is the justification for asking people to relocate, because we know the models and we have specialists to analyze them.
Okay, so there's a couple of another questions here. Jared asks, if we don't consider climate migrants as refugees, what might be some ways to compensate those migrants for loss of their sense of place or place values? I'm not sure what would be the right term to articulate the values. And also Desiree has a similar question. So if relocation is not a good solution, is it something about the way we relocate that it's a problem, or do we have to think, like Jared suggests, in totally different terms of compensation? So
two really good questions. And Jared, the sense of place is precisely the term that we're using in the literature. So what do we describe as sense of place? I was trying to allude to this in describing the Carteret Islands. So a sense of place comes from cultural ties, right? It comes from the fact that you may have a history with the place. It comes from the fact that your family or your ancestors have a history with the place. It comes from language that helps you explain the place. So it's the cultural connection, the collective cultural connection to a specific place, right? And people have argued that a sense of place depends on these cultural values, but also on political values. So some people say, well, a sense of place is basically whether or not you're politically self-determining. And I don't think that's true. And this is precisely why I think, and Jared has clearly picked up on this, that we can't compensate communities the same way as we can compensate individuals, because they have communal collective needs that we can't necessarily that we can't realize if we give them refugee status. And so how can we actually compensate people? This is exactly the question that is raised by the Carteret Islands. They chose, and this also goes to Desiree's question, right? So this is the most ideal scenario that we may have in trying to find a place where we can relocate to. But even in these most ideal circumstances, people chose against it. And that certainly has to do with a sense of place, right? So to give you a very banal example, think of cemeteries, or, I've lived in Canada for a very long time, and Canada has lots of indigenous nations. And the indigenous nations have a very particular understanding of the territory on which they live. They think of themselves as stewards of the territory, so it would be some kind of betrayal if they left it. And they think of their intimate ties to the territory. This is where their ancestors are buried, right? So it's really difficult to compensate people for that. And it might just be more honest to say, well, we can't compensate people for the loss of that territory, that meaning of the territory, the sense of place that Jared talks about. And I think that's ultimately what we have to face, that there is a harm that comes from climate-induced migration that we can't compensate people for.
So would there be any other measures that you could take to address this issue? Like you mentioned, people in New York are not very keen on moving or relocating either. So could there be other responses from the international society that we should expect or claim?
I mean, this is an interesting thing, right? If we look at the CAC framework, why did that come about the way it came about, right? I think the problem is that, as I said, much of climate-induced migration happens in the global south, but it is an internal displacement phenomenon. So it's not that people go across borders, but that people move within their borders. And of course, the question is to what extent the international community should step up and help individual states to actually protect their territory, right? So New York is thinking about building seawalls around Manhattan. Okay, so Manhattan, you know, is a very specific part of New York and the world. And we can imagine that New York State and also the United States of America obviously has enough resources to do that, right? But many states that are actually the most threatened by climate disaster are not able to do that. And so we can think of a kind of international system where, you know, the biggest polluters would have to pay in order for countries to beef up their protections of territory. But I think ultimately we will fool ourselves to imagine that we can actually halt the slow erosion of territory in some of the states. Again, I can only think of the Pacific Island states that are most threatened, and we won't be able to boost them and bolster them so that they can remain, right? So ultimately, yes, it should be a many-pronged approach, but we can't fool ourselves to think that we can compensate people sufficiently or endow states that are affected by climate disaster sufficiently with the tools, with the money to prevent disaster. I think we just need to be clairvoyant about this.
There's a question for distinction from Yassia. So in places vulnerable to climate change, which will be underwater in the future, like you mentioned, in the Pacific island, but also Bangladesh, you could argue, at least partially would be flooded. Government tend to arrange other places in urban areas or even other countries for the people with facilities. Are they then counted as climate migrants or climate refugees?
Well, I think they would be climate migrants, right? So, of course, I think that all climate-induced migrants are climate migrants and that nobody is a climate refugee, but I think they would be climate migrants. Again, and here, this is a really interesting example that Jassia proposes, because here we see a kind of proactive role of the state. So the state is taking on their duty of care for their citizens and tries to arrange a place where citizens can actually resettle. Of course, moving people to cities is a huge problem in itself, and we know this, right? So a lot of the global south is moving towards city. It is more and more a kind of the mega city is becoming the new norm in the global south, but people have a very different lifestyle in the global south. It may be less hard to work in the global south, but not necessarily, right? It's one thing to work as an agricultural worker. It's one thing to work as a pastoralist, and another thing to work in a factory in the city, right? So if you think about my autonomy argument, where I said, well, ultimately, we want people to be able to lead autonomous lives, and that involves choosing the kind of life that they hope to lead. The fact that they may have to be relocated into a city is not necessarily what we would understand as an autonomous choice. And then the way they will have to earn their living in the city is not necessarily their idea of a good life, right? So there's another harm that we're committing to some extent if we think that that is actually what we should be doing, that we just get people to safe places, which are very often cities.
So could I just ask you for clarification then? You would say that also climate migrants, even if we don't call them refugees, would be understood as forced migrants in a sense. Yeah. So there's no case in which climate migrants are moving voluntarily in this. Well,
this is my point, right? Ultimately, it can never be said that they move voluntarily because they have to react to some kind of thing that is imposed on them, right?
Yeah. So there's still some time left. We could open for people to ask comments in Zoom by raising their hands. if they want to join with the camera and audio. And while we wait, we could maybe also ask the question that we discussed in the course. So yes, there seems to be a specific collective harm to those that have to migrate due to climate disasters. But do they have to move as a community as well? I mean, even if the harm is addressed to the community, do they have to move as a collective, or could they move as individuals on autonomous decisions in that? Or it's not really an autonomous, but there is some autonomy still left in how they choose to relocate, if they have to relocate. So would that make a difference in terms of, say, the way sanctuaries could still have some function?
Well, so hang on. So if they move, because we imagine that there's a community that is threatened by climate change, and everybody says, well, let's just stick it out, right? We'll just stay here and see what happens. And then somebody says, oh no, I'm out of here, right? Because this is not going to work. So then obviously that person takes a migration decision, even though some people think that they don't need to move because they can still stay in the country or in the place where they are, right? So in that respect, we could say, okay, that's a bit more voluntary, right? Because they're reacting to kind of circumstance, but it's not imminent in the sense that it's not an imminent threat yet. So then take the next scenario. We have a community like the Carteret Island community that is to whom it is suggested that they move because of climate change. And we tell them, okay, well, here is your relocation scenario. You have collaborated. Let's make it deliberative, democratic, as fair and open as possible to tick all those boxes. And the community says, okay, contrary to the example I used, we move, right? And here's one person who says, okay, I'm happy to go because I need to go, but I don't want to go there, right? I want to not move with the community. I want to move individually, and I want to go somewhere else. And so to what extent do we owe something to this person that we haven't actually realized already by relocating the whole community? I think this is a fair question. And I think that if somebody decides to leave their community behind and move independently, then they would be considered a climate migrant. And then we need to think about how we treat climate migrants individually, right? So if somebody says the collective is not that important to me, can I just move on my own? I think we need to think about how we treat that person. The danger that I think Johannes is alluding to is that we don't want to restrict people, that they can only have assistance based on climate, that they can only have assistance for climate migration if they move as a collective, because that would be unfair, obviously, right? We don't want to make people beholden to their group. We want to enable them to have potentially good lives somewhere else. So if somebody decides against moving with the collective, I think, yes, we need to treat them like a migrant, and we need to treat them like a different, not an economic migrant necessarily, but somebody who has a certain kind of claim to be allowed to move somewhere. Yeah.
But not as strong a claim as a political refugee.
Not as strong a claim as a political refugee. And there's one
follow-up. Yeah, Jared had a follow-up one. Do we need specific policy targeted specifically for migrants? I'm not sure about the last part of it, but
well, yeah. He's talking about a specific policy for climate migrants. So I think that's a really interesting question, Jared. So I think a lot of the discussion has always been, okay, these people are refugees, these people are migrants. We don't think of these people as migrants, as refugees. And then some people say, well, what about economic migrants, right? They don't have access to the livelihood that they would hope for in the country of origin. Shouldn't they be counted as refugees? And then people say, no, because they're not persecuted, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that your question is spot on. I think we need to think about a different category of migrants who are climate migrants. And in particular, I think we need to think about what the international community owes them and potentially their countries of origin because of the natural disaster that makes them driven to the decision, right? I accept that they're not refugees. That's precisely my argument, because I don't think that we address their needs by applying that term to them. But I do think that we have a special obligation to them, which is akin to obligations towards refugees and different from the obligation we have towards other migrants.
Carol touches on the same topic, I guess. Given that the label migrant is often associated with voluntary economic migration, if we choose to not call climate-induced migrants refugees, do we need to come up with another term? Say, the Nansen Initiative has this term of externally displaced to capture some of the involuntariness.
So I think Carol and Jared's question going to the same direction. Yes, I think we need to have a third category of people that the international community should treat in a specific way and should treat them differently from refugees for the reasons that I talked about, but also differently from economic migrants, right? So take into consideration that non-voluntary aspect of their migration, and also take into consideration that there is, and this goes to the next question by Jasia, that there's more and more some kind of consensus that there is a responsibility for climate change, right? So somehow climate change is not happening because there are too many people on the planet. I mean, to some extent, yes, climate change is also happening because there are too many people on the planet, but climate change is happening because some countries pollute extraordinarily more than those who are most affected by climate change. So this goes to Jasia's question, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something more to that as well. It's not just this particular type of policy, but also if the polluter pay principle is sufficient to ground that responsibility, and if relocation is not a sufficient compensation, but say in these cases with these small specific islands, they are probably the only compensation, even if it's insufficient. So should we still consider that our best option, or are there other options that?
So I'm not trying to say that people are not owed compensation. I'm just saying that the compensation we can offer is not going to alleviate the harm, right? They're still harmed. I'm a moral and political philosopher. That's what I'm interested in, right? To what extent are people harmed if they have to move for climate reasons? I think they're still harmed. They are harmed. And potentially we can't compensate and alleviate the harm. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't compensate them, because of course it's important to actually compensate people. And now the question that Jasia asks is, how do we attribute responsibility for the compensation? Is it that we take polluter pays, so the biggest polluters have the highest duty to contribute? We could imagine an international fund, an international climate emergency fund. Or how should we distribute the responsibility for addressing the needs of climate migrants? And as I said, it's not for the lack of the states very often who want to relocate their people, but it's for not for lack of willingness, but lack of fund, lack of resources, right? Or if we want to relocate people across borders, of course, lack of territory. So I do think that polluter pays principle is a very good start. But of course, we also know from the discussion and from the failure of implementing Paris, etc., that it shouldn't just be a question of attributing responsibility to the biggest polluters. I think this has to be a moral argument that we're making, in the sense that those who are still, after having learned about the effects of their actions, continue to pursue the same actions, have a higher burden in compensation or paying than those who have polluted, but who are now really trying to change their policies in order to recognize the new reality of climate change.
I guess you could also make the argument that, say, China now, I think, is the biggest emitter in the world, but they're not the ones, well, Chinese citizens at least, are not the ones benefiting from those emissions. I think Norwegian citizens benefit much more from the Chinese emissions than Norwegians, than the Chinese do. So there's another principle that is
the beneficiary pays.
The beneficiary pays principle,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on those two?
I think ideally we would combine both, right? So China has tried to make the case that they are still in some aspects a developing country and that they haven't reached a certain level of standard of living and that they haven't contributed, that they haven't polluted for as long as some other countries that we know. And I think that's a fair point, but at some point we'll have to realize that, you know, it's not going to work if nation states simply try to get the best deal for themselves. I do think that the beneficiary pays principle is a good principle, because I think that actually realizes the reality of our lives, which is that many people still benefit tremendously from climate change, from climate emissions, right? And so will that actually make people change their habits? We'll see. But it will ultimately have to be a combination of the two principles in order to also attribute the kind of responsibility that I was talking about.
I think we're due, right? So
okay.
Thanks a lot, Christine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for all the questions. And
bye.
Have a nice one. Bye.